Good morning, everyone. Let's call today's strategic planning retreat to order at 9:08 a.m. Ben, do you want to call the roll?
Sure. So I'm going to go in a different order so I can remember everybody. So Sheets. Here. Swanson. Here. Nunnally. McNamee.
Here.
Falkowski.
Present.
Stanger.
Here.
Zibble.
Here.
Epic. Pismo.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Just so we know, Miss Nunnally is unable to make the retreat, but she is going to plan on attending the board meeting. Miss Pishmo will not be able to be here, and Mr. Epic will be here a little bit later in the morning. We have now called the meeting to order. I will turn it over to Mr. Capel for the introduction for the day.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of, some of you have been through this type of thing with us before, some of you haven't. So I just wanted to do a quick sort of how the day goes intro. First off, it's a public meeting, just like all our other meetings. So it's on YouTube. It's all the normal stuff as a regular board meeting. Just remember to use your microphone. I know you guys all know how to work them, but just a reminder, I know it's a long day. It's easy to forget to turn them on. We have some breaks planned, but if you need to get up or move around or something, this is not supposed to be as formal as a board meeting. So if you need to get up and move around, feel free. I think everybody knows where the bathrooms are. There may be some construction noise today. If there is, I apologize. They are working back in the boiler area back here. So we try to keep it to a minimum, but they have a schedule that they don't want to veer off of. And then lunch will be here just before noon, and we'll have time to kind of sit and drink. I think everyone knows, but cold drinks are in the fridge. There's coffee back there. If for some reason we needed to evacuate, the two doors here lead outside. You could go to the fenced area and you'd see employees like gathered there as part of the emergency procedures. If you're over there and you want to go out the front, same thing. So it's not something we usually have to worry about with a board meeting, but since we're going to be here all day, just something to think about. But other than that, that's my kind of, does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff for how the day is going to go? I don't think so. So I'm just gonna go straight into stuff if you want, which really is so some of the stuff that's on the agenda is to talk about the COVID funds, kind of jumping right in, that we got in 2020 and 2021. This is a little bit of background of what those funds are, when they arrived. We got 3 different payments for COVID funds in 2020 and 2021, totaling about $22.3 million. Just as a refresher, they came to us by formula. So the way the federal government distributed these funds was they took their standard formula for transit and distributed it the same way they do our normal grant money. They came to us without a request. We did not submit something that said, hey, we need this money. We got a letter that said, you've been awarded this much money. I think we talked about it a little bit when we got them, but if we had refused them, the way that the formula works is the funds are awarded to the region by FTA and then sub-awarded to the transit systems. And so the first step, if we or any transit system says we're not interested in these dollars, they stay in the region. So we would say, hey, we don't want these. Someone in the region would have the option to say, we do. And so if we had refused the funds and said we're not interested in these, I can say with 99% certainty they would have gone to RTA, because RTA would have said, yes, we need funds. To them, this is sort of a very small drop in a very large bucket. So we got the grant money. We spent it technically on operations and banked sales tax at the time. So the grant funds from COVID were the most flexible grant monies that I've ever seen in my career in 20 years. They had very few rules. So we spent them on operations. Took us about 2 years to spend all of them. You could use a different term. The term we are using is we banked the sales tax at the same time. Yes, the same amount. I thought it was important, we're talking about these now because we weren't sure how COVID was going to go. We didn't know what was going to happen. So we kind of sat on it because a lot of transit systems struggled. There's a lot of transit systems in the country that are still struggling as a result of COVID. We aren't quite in the same boat as a lot of our peers, but we all wanted to be safe and make sure we weren't going to have an issue. So we kind of waited to propose anything to do with the funds. But now that COVID is behind us, it's time to develop a plan, which I think is something we need to talk about today. So that's kind of how we got here. I also want to give a little bit of sort of side related information and help everyone understand how our cash works. Does anybody have any questions about the COVID grant dollars, how we got them and all that stuff? Sure.
You mentioned about the regional area.
Yeah.
What is that? Is that the NOACA? Would you consider that to be the NOACA area?
Yeah. So
So it's 7 counties or something?
it's a little more rigid than NOACA. NOACA has pieces of Portage and Summit County inside of it. For the federal dollars, it's really just Cleveland RTA, us, Geauga Transit, Medina County Public Transit, and Lorain County Transit. It's those 5 transit systems.
Okay.
So it could have been, and all of them got federal COVID money. Medina counties Geauga counties came through the state because they are rural. When you are urban, an urban transit system, the money comes directly to you. So we got the money directly, RTA got the money directly, Lorain and Medina both also got the money directly.
It was by formula, so everybody got different amounts.
Yeah, so what in a detail, what happens is the feds send money to the region. They don't really participate too much beyond that. RTA is then the designated distributor based on a formula that we develop in the region. So FTA has a suggested formula that you use to distribute money in the region, and they have to approve the one you use. But in theory, inside the region, you could distribute money differently. So RTA has a formula. Once the money comes in, they say, here's the formula that we've used for years. We use the recommended formula from FTA that's based on population, revenue miles, and some other stuff. Same one we always use. RTA said, here's the money that came from the feds. Here's everybody's share. At a NOACA Transit Council meeting, we all vote on it, that we all agree. And then the money that vote is communicated to FTA and the money is distributed that way.
Okay, great, thanks.
Any other questions about that so far? All right. Changing gears a little bit, but as sort of part of the same context, because that $22 million is basically sitting as cash in our account right now. I thought it was important to understand a little bit, and this is something that Gary and I have talked about a bunch, about a little bit about how cash works, about how capital is managed. So I thought it was important to understand how currently we manage sales tax in the organization. So sales tax income comes to us from the state every month, and it goes into the operating budget. So when we put the budget together for the year, every year, all of the sales tax, all 100% that we believe is going to come and that does end up coming, goes to the operating budget. Goes from A to B. It doesn't stop anywhere. It's all part of the operating budget. At the end of the year, when the operating budget is sort of over and we see how we did, which usually, traditionally, almost every year I've been here, we've been under budget. The remainder goes into our cash balance. Now, depending on how Lisa is doing accounting, that could happen a couple times a year, once a year. It varies a little bit, but the money flows: sales tax, operating budget, cash balance. So the operating budget is primarily funded by sales tax income, grants, fares are in there too, but the two big ones are sales tax and grants. Once the money is in the cash, in the cash balance, it can then be spent on capital expenditures. And so the capital budget gets funded by grants and the cash balance. Some transit systems allocate a certain percentage of sales tax on an annual basis to go to the capital budget as a revenue. We don't do that. There's no rule that says we could or couldn't, but this is how traditionally we have managed our funds. The only other thing that can happen is sometimes, and we haven't had to do this, the cash balance could also fund the operating budget. But we still, even if that happens, there still isn't right now any plans for sales tax income to go directly into capital expenditures. So why that's important, or why I thought it was important to go over that, is I have a little preview of what we'll talk of this slide that'll be at the board meeting. This is the slide that Gary and I have had a lot of conversations about. This is where it's at right now. It certainly can change in the future if we want to make adjustments to it. But understanding how the cash balance functions, I thought was important for this conversation today. And so when you look at, starting from the top, our total cash, if you look at a bank account, this is generally how much you should see. Now it's spread out in some investment accounts, and it's not all in one account that you'll see this number. But we have the operating reserve, which is 5 months of cash. That's based on a board resolution that was passed. That gets changed when the CAFR is approved. So when the CAFR is approved on an annual basis, that's when this is recalculated. So it's recalculated once a year. Certified annual financial report. Sorry. And so when the board approves that, and that usually happens at the same time as the audit, so I believe that's on the agenda for the board meeting tonight, that's when this gets recalculated for the year. So it's always about a year behind. What Gary and I have spent a lot of time with, and I think this is a good, I think Gary agrees with me. He'll tell me if he doesn't. The next parts are, and I guess I should talk by this section, committed funds. These are funds where the board has passed some type of approval. In the case of the operating reserve, they passed a resolution saying what it should be. For the next one, local share of board approved projects, this is the local share of contracts the board has directly approved, whether it be a bus purchase, the building project, or any project the board has officially taken action on that has local money is in that number right there. So 6.1, almost $6.2 million, the board has officially taken action on. The next one is the local share of grant commitments. So this is money that will be used to match grants that we have received. So when we apply for a grant with the feds or with the state or with almost anybody, we have to certify that we have the local dollars available to match that grant. So Lisa completes a process where she certifies that we have cash available to meet that grant. So that's the 20% generally of grants we have applied for.
But these are only applied for, they're not actually received.
It's a combo. So there could be some that we have applied for, others that we have actually received.
So this is actually sort of a worst case. Highest expense. If we could all the grants.
Yeah.
Applied for and were received, this is what we've got.
Yes.
When we're saying applied for, does it mean applied for and you don't know whether you're getting it or not? Or they've said you've gotten the letter that says you're going to get it, and that's when it goes on the financial paperwork.
It's both. So if we apply for it now, if we apply for it and think we have a really poor shot at it, we wouldn't put it in here. we use a little bit of judgment. These are things that we have a relatively good belief will be awarded. And there's technically, when we talk about grant awards, there's two processes. So there's when we get money by formula from the feds, which is a direct federal, we just talked about that process. We apply for money through ODOT and the feds. So there's the initial sort of application, which is to request the dollars commonly in a competitive way. So the feds say, hey, we got a bucket of money. We say, yeah, we want some. We submit an application. They say, yes, you got it. No, you didn't get it. But that's the first application. Then there's a technical application that happens later. So that one is usually the one that determines this number. But there could be another technical application that comes after that, which is like when ODOT says, yeah, you won the money, but ODOT's just handing out federal money. We still have to go through a process to get the money from the feds. So there's every grant has two applications, which sounds kind of silly, but usually the first one is what tells you if you got money or not. So this is not, it's not for sure that we'll have to spend all $2.6 million, but we have a high level of confidence that we will, which is why it's in this kind of committed section. Sure.
The grants that we get, are they all reimbursement type grants where you have to spend the money at first and then get the reimbursement?
Yes.
And then when does that affect the numbers on the committed fund areas?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah. Virtually all of our grants, occasionally we'll get a unique one that isn't a reimbursement, but all of the federal grants, the vast majority of the state grants are reimbursement. So we spend the money and they reimburse us. That happens sort of in the background. There isn't like a easy report that you see that happen. But in theory, you know, if we had to spend all $2.6 million of that at the same time, we would be spending, you know, $8.5–9 million out of the cash balance and then be reimbursed after that.
And how quick does that happen, reimbursement?
It's pretty fast.
Okay.
It usually takes when Lisa submits the request for it, I think their commitment is 3 days.
Oh, okay.
So it's when we process it, but when you process it, you have to have the invoice. If it's a bus, you have to have completed the post delivery audit. So there are some things we have to do before we get to that push the money button. But when you do push the money button, it comes pretty quick, unless the federal government is shut down or there's some strange thing happening with the feds. But normally it's quick.
The question I was really trying to get to, I guess, really was through the reimbursement process, do we see the cash balance drop quite a bit and then come back like on a seesaw type thing, or is it just a small blip?
You wouldn't see big drops in it often. Large bus purchases like the local route buses or the commuter express buses, you would probably see a blip because, you know, those are $8 to $16 million payments that all happen at once.
Yeah.
So you can see a drop then. Most of the time, though, you won't. I mean, you might see small movements, but you're not going to see giant sort of swings.
Okay.
Questions so far? Okay. The next section is, and so the way we ordered this is sort of most rigid to least rigid. So in the section called uncommitted funds, these are dollars that the board has not taken formal action on. So the board has in no way has the board sort of opined on these items. The 2024 to 2027 capital plan projections, you haven't taken action on, but it is in your board packet every month. So you do get to see it with regularity. That, and this is probably one of the areas Gary and I had the most conversation about. So hopefully I refresh my memory is correct in my analysis that I give you guys here. This is what we as a staff think will be spent in the next 5 years or 3 years. So we went through a process using what our judgment is based on, you know, in that projection, there's a lot of bus purchases. Since I've worked here, we've virtually never bought a bus that wasn't 100% grant funded in some. And when I say 100%, I mean 80%. That hasn't had a full commitment of grant dollars behind us. It's rare for us to buy a bus without grant money to it. So in this projection, you see us projecting we will get grant dollars for the bus and pay 20% local for the share. The other projects, there's a few projects that may have a different breakdown. A lot of them are going to be 80-20, especially buses. There's some things in here which are harder to project. So in 2028, I think, is when the roof is scheduled, or 2027. Can't remember which year. The roof is in the schedule in the sort of near future. Can we get grants for it? Yes. Is that a more difficult thing to get grants for? Yes. So when we put it in the projection, it's sort of a project, and this is probably one of the better examples of, we know we have to do it. You know, we know at some point that project will have to take place. So there is some question about how do we plan for that in the capital projection. Right now, it would be in there at probably, I think that it's in there at 100%, because we know it has to happen. We don't know right now what grant we may or may not get for it. As we apply for grants, we will change the projection to reflect any grants we have gotten. So that number is a hybrid, and it's sort of staff's best estimate. But it's mostly going to be local match at 80-20, most of it. But there are some things in it that might be 100%, and they are indicated individually in that report that you get in the board packet. So you can see what our sort of guesstimates are for what those items are. So you can see every project that makes up this thing, and you can see what their estimated grant local dollar breakdown is. This one is hard for us because it's a judgment call, right? We have to do our best estimate, but it doesn't make sense. And Gary and I talked about this. It doesn't make sense for us to say it's all 100% grant funded, but it doesn't also make sense to say it's all not 100% grant funded. It's sort of in the middle. And then the last one, undesignated cash, and we can talk about what term we like best. That's dollars in the bank account that don't have any stated purpose at this time. Yes. And so those are dollars that when we go through all these exercises of saying what we think we're going to need to spend, where things need to be, those are dollars that don't have a purpose today. Now, this is a little bit of a newer process. And so if we want to discuss, and I'm not saying we do this necessarily right now, but as we adjust the capital plan, if there's things that the board says, hey, I don't know about that one, or we don't agree with that, you can, as we do it, you can give us input and to tell us, hey, that project, no, or like, hey, we really like that project. Let's make that one a priority. That's sort of why we put it in there, is your opportunity to sort of give us opinions as it goes. And, the further out it is, the less firm it is, but as it moves up, the stuff you're seeing for like 25 is getting firmer. So I think that's hopefully a good summary of what we kind of talked about, Gary, but I thought it was important to understand as we talk about this stuff, how the cash in the organization kind of works. And so Donna's question was, where is the COVID money? Today, it is sitting in undesignated cash. And I mean, it's sort of a placeholder, right? It's ultimately all sales tax dollars. The COVID money is more of like, how do we get this balance? It's not actual grant money that has a purpose. It's just cash today.
So it encompasses the majority of the undesignated cash at this time, because it was 22 and the total undesignated is 26. So so the majority of the cash in that account is the COVID money.
It is the reason that dollar is so high.
Okay.
Normally, when we when we do our projections and estimates and plans for sales tax, we don't plan for a balance like that. You know, it's not, I don't really believe, and I think the board probably would agree with this, that we shouldn't take money from the public that we don't have plans for. You know, we shouldn't be, you know, we're not here to hold money as a on account, you know, that does no one any good. You know, that's, there's no purpose, right? I mean, we should take the money that the public has asked us to take and provide service with it. We should have enough on account that we can do business, but we shouldn't just sit on a pile of money. You know, that's
Right.
not responsible government, in my opinion.
Just to clarify with what I think Kim was asking, that designated cash would be only about $4 million if we hadn't gotten all the COVID money.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess my point was, when we did all our sales tax projections and budgeting and planning for the levy,
Right.
we would not have planned, and we did not plan for a balance like this.
Right.
Right.
It is only a result of COVID. Sure.
That levy in 19 was planned for, to use your physiology, because we were in such serious straits with the number of passengers we had and the problems we were having delivering service. I mean, some of us couldn't even get from Willoughby to Menor, Concord area, without taking 2 buses to get there. And we were in danger of having catastrophic cuts without the 19 levy.
Hey, Ben, what's the $498,691 for STS? I thought that money from the sale of the property went into that account just to hold it there. That's not STS money. That's money that should be in Laketran.
So
We
it's-
can't spend that money on STS. I thought that was supposed to be a separate entity in itself and should be self-supporting if we're going to continue on with it. You can't just transfer 300 and some thousand into an account that we're not even, it's not even part of it's Laketran, really.
Yeah, so when the Atkins Road property was sold, the board voted to put the money into a separate bank account that would be STS's sort of nest egg. And
It would be
so
what?
sort of STS's funds. So
I don't remember voting to put it in for STS's funds. I thought STS, I don't even know why we put it in there. I don't remember anything like that. That money should be transferred over to Laketran because my understanding when we started STS is it's going to be something that's going to have to be a standalone company itself and not funded by Laketran.
I'll just add a little bit. When we sold the Atkin Road property, which I think was about $750,000, at the time, it was, I believe, defined as local money. And the reason the board at the time put it into STS was the board created the separate entity of STS because it could only be done with local money. And for lack of a better phrase, it was sort of a one-time windfall, if you will. But to your point, though, the initial balance, I believe, was about $750, but operating costs, et cetera, have brought that down considerably by about a third. But at the time, the board did vote to create the separate entity and put the money there. Certainly, and I think it's on the afternoon agenda, the board can change their mind and say, we don't want to do STS and we don't want to invest any more into it. And now would be the time to do that.
My recollection isn't exactly like that, but that's okay.
But STS is definitely on the agenda for today. So, and that money, you know, it is still Laketran's money. So it's in a separate bank account. But if the board says, hey, we don't want to do this anymore, it would go back in, it would get transferred in, and you would see that undesignated cash number go up.
Well, I just don't want us to get into trouble by the government coming along and saying, Well, you're spending money for Laketran into a company that for all intents and purposes has no income other than the fares they charge, and that's never going to support it.
Yeah, I think that some of this will be better in our I mean, I think we're gonna be talking about that today for sure in the STS part. I mean, we can skip to that right now if you would prefer, but
Well, no, you've got it on here, so I think it's a reasonable question.
Yeah.
It started out as $700,000. We've already spent 300,000 or 200,000, whatever.
Yeah.
And what do we get out of that?
yeah, we'll talk about that, but I do agree with you. STS is something we need to make some decisions on for sure.
Already made mine.
Does anybody else have any other questions? That's like, so I kind of wanted to give, this is a lot of background.
I just have one question. I appreciate all the time, Ben, that you spent tutoring me on this. Some of these things don't come, they don't flow. After all, I do put cream cheese in the coffee maker.
By the way, Gary sold his airplane.
But I do appreciate the time.
Yeah, you weren't here.
We're not going to talk about that anymore. So now I've lost my train of thought. The question for the other board members that I have is, do we like this sort of presentation? To me, it makes a little bit more sense to be able to encapsulate where cash sits, in designated buckets. One of the thoughts that I had was if we were to add down at the bottom, he's got a footnote, refer to the capital plan update report for some of these, some of the numbers. Does that make sense? That we would refer to the, further on in our financials to get the details of those numbers? Okay.
Yeah, I really like it. And I thank you, Gary, for taking the time to, figure it out and everything. I think it looks great.
Thank you.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts for any of these kind of background items? So next, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to talk about the sales tax.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everybody saw the memo that was circulated. You'll recall that this matter was originally discussed probably in February. And at that point, the first question was whether or not the board, upon its own action, could reduce or eliminate the collection of the sales tax. We discovered, yes, in fact, the board can resolve to do so. However, the question was, what are the steps required to follow upon doing so? And that was a little bit of a bigger project. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people to talk to and figure out how to go down that path. So I think the memo circulated earlier, maybe about a month or so ago, indicated that, yes, the board can make those decisions. Once that's done, however, it's submitted to the Board of Elections. And prior to that, of course, pursuant to revised code, there has to be a petition signed by at least 10% of the electors in the county. So once that's done, it goes on to the ballot. And then from there, the electors decide what they want to do. And then it gets certified to the tax commissioner. I'm simplifying it obviously so as not to drag it out, and everybody saw the memo, but that's really kind of the gist of how it goes. And the idea is that you have to get 10% of the folks out there to agree with the board's position to then take it to the electorate for a vote.
How many registered voters are in the county?
I don't know. I didn't look into that, but I'd be happy to do so.
We have to have public hearings similar to the whole, I know when you guys when Laketran makes changes, you have to have a whole specific process. Would it follow that process?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. The statutes don't necessarily indicate that there has to be public hearings, like you're changing a route or something else. In most cases, though, that's probably the preferred course to do so. It has to be published just as you would otherwise. You get the petition, it has to be published in the newspaper. The steps are somewhat laborious, believe it or not.
Yes.
And as I understood it, it would have to go on the ballot,
Correct.
and there's a cost to doing that.
Well, yeah, I mean, to get the petitions and get it signed, if you had a volunteer group potentially. But otherwise, yeah, any ballot issue that comes about, there'd be some cost to be funded.
And we could not use Laketran money that's derived from the sales tax. And we could not use FOL money.
Yeah, if I understood, you can't use Laketran funds to support the petition and the action, correct? Just as, in any particular effort of that nature for a public entity.
So it's a relatively complicated process to actually execute.
Yeah, and as I mentioned to everybody, I was a little bit surprised and there's, by reading the statutes and going through the process, we talked to just about every state entity from the Secretary of State to even the prosecutor's office who advises the local board of elections. We wanted to make sure that we had the process down. So yeah, it's more than you might think.
I suppose as maybe one of the chief instigators in this process, because I feel very strongly that to your comment earlier, Ben, we shouldn't be sitting on taxpayer dollars beyond what we need to perform our expected duties. And so the idea had been, could we simply, at least in my mind, delay or reduce the tax until we balanced back out to what we thought was the appropriate amount of cash, to, again, not to cut any services or anything like that, but just sort of get things back to a norm that would be sustainable going forward. It is really amazingly disappointing to me that it is so convoluted to try to give the taxpayers money essentially back to them. It's an oversimplification, but it's I could go off on a tirade about this silliness of this, but I just find it disappointing that it has to be that complicated.
Yeah, it's somewhat surprising. You would think as an initial matter when you first broached the topic that, okay, if the board resolved that they didn't want this for whatever reason, that the board could take that action, right? As a public entity, as a board. But I guess the framers of the statutes and everything else must have decided that, look, if the electorate's going to decide to give it, the electorate has to decide to take it away. And we can't allow anybody else to make that decision for us. It was surprising. And I got to be honest with you, I mean, because it seems a little bit out of whack is why we confirmed with the Secretary of State, the Board of Elections, the tax commissioner, and everybody else, just to make sure that it was correct.
Well, Brandon,
Mhm.
since we can't give it back, it is taxpayer money. Is there other things we can use it for? Transfer it for example, the commissioners so that they can fund the bridges and roads and bridges that have been closed out in Leroy and places like that. Also, can we give it our excess money to help fund the safety center or jail, whatever you want to call it? Those are all taxpayer funded things. Why should we sit on 26 million, whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. Can't we give it to another entity that is funded by the taxpayers so that we can get some of these projects done that they're crying about? There's not enough money for roads and bridges. There's not enough money to fund an entire jail without trying to go into a 30-year program of bonds and stuff like that. I mean, my heavens, this is ridiculous. If we can't do that, is there a reason we can't?
Yeah, my understanding is because when it was voted in, it was rather specific as being provided to Laketran for certain Laketran related things, right? Support Laketran, support those things. So it wouldn't, Laketran then couldn't necessarily resolve to give it to somebody else. You can't, that unfortunately it doesn't work that way. I would have to maybe research a little bit further to see if there's any kind of exception, but I've not found anything to date that says the money could be given to any other entity because the voters gave that money to Laketran, right? So it's
Then
kind of
maybe
the same
we ought to
principle.
Put something on the ballot for the voters to say, well, excess money from Laketran can be given to these other people and have a vote on that. Because if the people vote for that, then it becomes legal if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think if there was any, petition or otherwise and follow the procedure to say this is what we want to do with this money, then again, you'd follow the same procedures and get 10% of the electorate to sign and then present it going forward. Just, with any other way, but it has to go to a vote. Any of this money to have it reduced or eliminated or changed otherwise has to be voted by the electors.
That's absolutely ridiculous, but that's beside the point.
When Laketran initially went on the ballot for the sales tax levy, what percentage of the voters had to sign a petition?
I would have assumed it would have been 10% at that time, perhaps even maybe a little bit less.
Well,
10%. The reason
10% is high.
the reason I'm asking is because 10% sounds like a very large burden.
Mhm.
And I don't recall like having petitions circulated that took a lot of time. I will now defer to Mr. Swanson.
I don't think it's 10% of the registered voters. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it read 10% of the voters who voted in the last general election.
Right.
Which is a completely different number.
Right.
It's a much smaller number. Let's say 50% of the voters showed up.
Sure.
Then you're only going to get 10, you only have to sign 10% of that 50%, not 10% of the 100%.
That's
I'll
correct.
bet it wasn't 50% either.
Well,
Do you remember what?
The board, when the board puts a levy on the ballot, they don't have to do that. The board votes to ask the public if they want to spend the money. There's not a process where to put the sales tax on the ballot the first time, there's no petition process.
So to put the sales tax on the ballot, there's no petition process. And to do a renewal, there's no petition process.
Correct.
Sorry, I just want to
Yeah,
understand.
those are done at a vote of the board. And so the board votes to either put a levy at a certain rate on the ballot or renewal at a certain rate on the ballot. And the board votes on the language that the voters will see after, in our case, Paul took it to the Secretary of State to get it approved first. But then the board actually votes on the language that goes on the ballot. And so when the 2019 levy was put on the ballot, it was an increase of 0.25% for transit purposes. And so that just requires a board vote. There's no petition process at all.
That was before my time. I didn't research, those processes by which to put a levy on the ballot or otherwise. So that I'm sure is accurate.
So does that imply then that we wouldn't have to get the 10% to get it removed? Or is our government is so perverse in so many ways financially, it boggles my mind. But what they're saying, if I get this right, is that there's a higher hurdle to return taxpayer money than there is to ask for it in the first place. That is so upside down.
Yeah.
I think the reason is that the voters made a decision on the current money. So it makes it, from what I've heard from Brandon and other folks, it's like, the electorate decided that they wanted that money to be spent by Laketran. So they are the ones that have to decide that it shouldn't be spent, I guess.
Oh, yeah, I'm not debating that they get a vote in this. But it's the petition part. If we're not required to get a petition to ask them for money, why would we be required to get a petition to return the money?
Can't answer that one.
That seems a perverse hurdle to me.
Yeah. And the only presumption is because it's already been voted on and now any change, it's already been, right? I mean, so the initial bringing of it to Ben's point is, okay, the board's going to authorize that we want this to be done. So we're going to take it, get it certified, put it on the ballot as an initial matter. Usually in those cases, and I am not an election law attorney by any stretch, and I don't want to pretend to be, and I've not put any ballots on myself. But, most cases, for instance, I think there's been in the news, the marijuana issue that's forthcoming. They had to get a number of signatures, and do they validate those signatures? It was a whole issue, right? And again, I don't pretend to know that stuff, but I do know that from everything we've read is that there's no question that since the voters have made this decision, now it has to go back to them to make any decision to undo it, which we, have beaten that horse, I guess. But
Do we know
The
how much?
current levy goes till 2029.
Yeah, so the levy was passed in November of 19, so the current one would expire in November of 19. Well,
November of 29.
I'm sorry, of 29. Collections are a little behind that, so collections didn't start until May of 20. And so collections would end roughly 6 months after it expired or changed or whatever.
Do we know how many people voted that we'd have to get 10% of? Do we have that statistic?
It's 10% of the last general election.
Yep.
Can get it.
Well, at that point, are we talking about doing something different later or now that would determine what election we had to look back on to calculate the 10%?
Well, if I understand, Donna, what they're saying is at the time that you make the decision that you want to put something on the ballot, or petition to put something on the ballot, you have to get 10% of the previous general election.
Okay, that's how I was here, but then based on the conversation, wasn't sure. So I'm glad you and I are thinking the same thing.
Yeah, so for instance, if we did it in 26, it would be the 25 general election, if there is a general election in 25, something like that.
So if we just look at the November 8th, 2022 general election, there were 162,000 registered voters in Lake County. There were 95,000 ballots cast. So let's call it 9,500 signatures would be needed. If you went back to the last presidential cycle, there were 163,000 registered voters and 131,000 cast. So that would be 13,000. So let's just say for signatures that don't work out, you're talking about roughly 10,000 signatures based off of the last general election cycle. I mean, I'm by no means a political canvasser. 10,000 sounds like a lot of signatures and a lot of work.
It is.
Well, and remember too, the 10,000, those have to be validated. So in most cases on these issues, people are getting almost double that, just, for any issue brought forth.
And that's because the signers don't necessarily remember or know if they're registered to vote.
Exactly.
So no, it's a very cumbersome, lengthy process.
And I believe, Ben, you jump in on this question because this could potentially result in a reduction of service or put us back in a situation where we don't have enough buses or drivers based on the money we would then have, that we would have to go out with public hearings
Yeah, I said
and
that.
explain this and thoroughly explain, okay, this is what we can do. This is how it must be done. And this could be the end result.
I think, speaking at least from my own perspective and the perspective of conversations I've had with others, nobody was suggesting that we return money that would then negatively impact our ability, our capacity to serve the public. The intent was to balance out, we talked a little bit about having 26 million, but a more normal number would have been $4 million. The intent was to get back to that sort of a balance, not let's diminish service or let's return all this money and then go bankrupt. I mean, to make it, to take the argument to an extreme. That was never the intent. The intent was, is there a way for us over a period of time to get our expenses and our cash balance to merge back to a more normal process because we got this big lump of COVID money that is distorting who we are. That was the intent of the discussion that I've had anyway.
I agree.
If, let's say hypothetically, we were going to instruct Ben and the staff to look at this and determine what that balance was. I think we would have to really look at projections based on, to use your figures, about $4 million. When the organization has already grown, we're going to need some pretty serious financial analysis to make sure that what we want to add, that we can go forward on, at least until the end of the life of this thing. We couldn't just put numbers out there and then not be certain that we can support what we're trying to deliver.
Sure, absolutely. Nobody would propose making a decision in the blind. I mean, this would have to be a responsible, informed decision. The question really came from, is this even an option? You know, to balance out this. You know, if you look at the Metro Parks and the what's the other big group? Deepwood and us, we're sitting on an unbelievable amount of taxpayer dollars. And it's well over $100 million that everybody's holding. That's taxpayer property. That's not our property. And so the question was, is there a way to responsibly balance back out a more appropriate amount of funds that we have available to us? That was the question. The question wasn't, let's just willy-nilly cut and deal with bad consequences when they show up. The idea was, is there a way to do this responsibly? That's where this conversation began. Nobody talked to me about reducing services. I've had no conversations in that regard.
I have a question. Brandon, if we went forward with something like this, is it for the full 1/4% or is there a incremental adjustment?
Yeah, it could be incremental or it could be down to zero. I mean, that's, yeah,
It doesn't
absolutely.
state what it has to be, but even though I know when we passed it, it had to be 1/4%.
Right, yeah.
So I would have thought that it would have been eliminating the whole 1/4%.
Now, you could do it incrementally. It wouldn't have to be in total.
Actually, if I remember the conversation, there are two different calculations of the reducing rates. And I'm not sure which one is the right one. But two different statutes one talks about 3/5 and the other one talks about 1/4 points or 8% points or something. And you end up with different numbers depending on which of these two statutes you look at. And I'm not sure we ever got far enough into it to really resolve that exactly.
Yeah.
There are
Well,
conflicting, it appears to be conflicting information.
Sales tax can only be charged in tenths or quarters.
Right.
So it has to either, you could do you could do 0.1, 0.2, or 2.5. That's all, those are the choices. Within that quarter, it has to be a tenth or a quarter. You could do 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, all the way up, or quarter, half, $75. Those are there are two statutes that say you can do that, but you can't do anything other than that.
Doesn't that tie back to the old school cash registers, which
Yeah.
this is all fixed with technology?
Yeah, there was a vote. It was the only reason I know this is because it was the Toledo RTA that helped change this at the state level because they wanted to go on the ballot for 0.3. And so they got it changed temporarily for a year. And then later the legislature changed it to any increment of 0.1 or 0.25. So those are the choices. So if you were to reduce it, you could do 0.2 or 0.1. Those are your options. And so, yeah.
I think this begs another question. maybe we kick around for just a couple of minutes, and that is, let's assume that this is just so awkwardly complex that it just doesn't hold much appeal to us. What other options do we have? If essentially we draw, and help me if I'm oversimplifying this, please. But if we essentially draw $23 million a year roughly in sales tax, and we spend roughly $23 million a year, what do we do with this $26 million pig in the snake that's going to sit there forever? I mean, what do we do with it?
Well, can we go back and refuse the CARES dollars or the other $22 million that we have taken? I mean, that'll wipe out the 26 million almost within $4 million. I mean, if we don't need the money, do we care if RTA gets it? No, it's for all intents and purposes, taxpayer money that is being freely distributed. And so RTA gets it, I don't care. If we don't need it, why do we care who gets it?
My thought on that, Lane, is that we spent the CARES money. We spent the money that we got from the federal government already. This is all local Lake County tax money that we've collected. So giving it to RTA or giving it to Lorraine or Medina would not be in my best interest of the taxpayers for Lake County.
Plus the fact.
That's
I thought we
money's
were here-
fungible, and that, I mean, you can argue that back and forth, Chuck.
I
Really.
understand. And the other question that I would have too is, okay, if you did the reduction of the 0.25%, then you're going to take $9 million out of our revenues every year. And that basically says in 2.5 years, you're out of money. Again, you're back to what are you going to do then? You're going to have to either reduce services or you're going to have to get.
No, you
0.25%
you
back.
put that in the ballot language and say, we're going to reduce it by 0.25% or a 0.2 or point whatever it is until we work down this surplus that came from COVID. And then once that's done and we get down to what we've determined to be the appropriate going forward balance, the full tax will resume. I mean, to me, this isn't an all or nothing thing. This is you put it on the ballot and let the taxpayers say, yeah, that makes sense, or no, keep the money. I mean, to me, that's not difficult.
How
There
would
may be
we-
parts of the constituency that won't take the time to try to understand it, but that's always the case.
So Gary, your initial question at this most recent juncture was, let's just possibly agree that the ballot process is incredibly cumbersome. What do we do with the $20+ million? Well, I think some of that conversation does tie into what Ben wants to talk about next, because I believe if we're talking about new services, certainly that's going to spend money. But in terms of brainstorming, I mean, the sky is the limit. Lane for a very long time on the board has talked about free service for Laketran or et cetera. I mean, it could be anything that someone could come up with. I do believe that and I think Brandon confirmed this a little, you can't just give the money to another governmental entity, but there are plenty of things that certainly could be done to give the Lake County taxpayer value, for lack of a better phrase.
And I thought that was a major piece of why we're here today, to discuss finally, after the many years, starting in late 2008, early 2009, when we determined with the rapid fall in sales tax after the financial meltdown, that we had a catastrophic situation pending because we had so many passengers and not enough money to go forward with that sales tax decline. And that finally, today, we could have conversations about the increases in service and what we can do to help our seniors, people with disabilities, students, and so on, to get to their jobs, healthcare, grocery stores.
Ben, how much was fair revenue last year?
I would,
$1 million?
yeah, do you mean direct passenger fares or fares and contracts?
Fares and contracts.
Probably, I would want to look this up, but it's roughly $2.5 million.
Okay,
Let me,
$2.5 million. That certainly takes a while to bleed down 26 million, but at the same token, you don't just want to put service, you don't want to go from one extreme where you're cash rich to then having so much service that you've spent the money so quick. So I do think there is a
Right.
balance. I do think there is brainstorming, and I do think that's why we're here today. Donna. I think that's a very fair comment.
yeah, so, well, everyone's looking at me. Yeah, I mean, I have a break scheduled at 10:15, so it's 10:10,
So
I think.
do we want to take a break now and then after the break, move into some of the new service discussion, or do we want to talk about sales tax a little bit more? I'm open for anything, or if we want to talk about new services and then circle back, I hate that phrase, I'm sorry, to the sales tax, I'm up for anything.
I think we should discuss new service.
I think that I would agree only because I think that that informs the overall discussion. To get some information about potential new services, as it does lead back to, you know, they're very connected is what I'm trying to say. So I think it would be a good idea to, you know, get some context.
Because we will begin to have a better idea what new service we want to add. And then Ben and the staff can determine the actual cost of doing it.
Okay, but we're leaving the sales, if we talk about new service, that's fine, but we're leaving the sales tax discussion open to follow up on it after some of the new service, as long as no one objects. Okay, great. It's 10:10. Let's all reconvene at 10:25.